Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about 6 reasons your rum is not bubbling, and we're talking about before the airlock. So it's not bubbling within the jar. So number 1 is that the pH levels before pitching the yeast is either too high or too low. The optimal pH for rum or other alcohol is at 5.2, and if it's lower than 5.2, that means your solution is too acid, and if it's higher than 5.2, it's too alkaline and it's not optimal for the yeast to perform at its best. In order to determine the pH of your wash, you have either a digital pH meter, you have pH strips, and if you're too lazy to measure the pH, you just put in a pH stabilizer and it'll automatically stabilize it to 5.2. However, if you do not have this pH stabilizer and it's too acid or too basic, do not fret, we have solutions for you. So if your pH is too acid, meaning below 5.2, you may add potassium bicarbonate or calcium carbonate until it reaches 5.2. Another item that you may have at home that's easier to add if your pH is too low is baking soda. So you add more baking soda and your pH will go up to the level that you'd like. If, however, your pH is too alkaline, meaning the number is higher than 5.2, then you'd like to make your solution more acid. And in order to do so, you can squeeze a lemon inside the jar. You can also add tomato paste, which is an odd thing to do, but some people do it. Let me know if you've tried tomato paste before. More specifically, tomato paste has a pH of roughly 3.5 to 4.7, so it's pretty acid. And there's a difference in taste between food with low pH versus food with high pH. So food with low pH or acid food are more sour, and food that are more alkaline or high pH levels are more bitter. So I did a little research on rum making ingredients and their pH. And what I found was that sugar and molasses both have the same pH, around 5 to 6. But honey has a pH of 3.9. So this is a little low. It's more acid compared to molasses and sugar. So if you'd like to replace your sugar or molasses by honey, it might affect the yeast in the sense that your liquid might be too acid for the yeast to perform at its optimal level. So that's something you got to watch out for if you want to replace your sugars with honey. So as you may know, lemon is more acidic than other ingredients. And one of the mistakes that I've done in my previous washes is squeezing lemon inside my wash. And instead of affecting it by having a lemony taste, it affected my pH. My pH went so low that it was around 2. And in order to compensate for that, I had to add baking soda and other ingredients to increase my pH levels all the way up to 5.2. That's one thing that you want to watch out for. Just the fruits that you're adding into your wash before fermentation. And if you'd like to have more information on pH levels, it's pretty easy to find it online. You'll have a sort of chart, an official chart, and you'll see the most common food and what is their pH level. And another solution to make your solution more acid would be to add calcium sulfate. If you have other tricks to increase or decrease the pH, I've seen a few of them, so let me know in the comments below, and the community will be able to benefit from these other suggestions. Once the pH level is stabilized or at around 5.2, some people add oyster shells in order to keep this pH at that level. Therefore, it won't fluctuate, go up and down, and it'll stay at that optimal level. And just to let you know that as you add more ingredients into your jar, like sugar, water, anything else that you'd like to add, your pH levels are going to change. So the most important time to check your pH is before pitching the yeast. You do not have to consistently check the pH as your fermentation goes by, because it's normal that it'll change and the yeast will be affected by it most right after it is inserted inside the solution. A second reason why your wash might not be bubbling is the temperature is not optimal. So it could be either too hot and the yeast cells have died, or if it's too cold, the yeast cells are dormant and are laying at the bottom of the jar. We've talked about this in the other videos, so you can take a look at them when you have the chance. A third reason for which your wash is not bubbling is that there's a lack of yeast nutrients. So yeast nutrients, they invigorate the yeast, they make them alive, they help them eat the sugar. And if there's not enough, then the yeast might underperform. It is to be noted that in turbo yeast, the package includes nutrients. So once you pitch turbo yeast, it's like you're pitching the yeast, including the nutrients inside your jar. Turbo yeast has been associated to off flavors. So if you're one of those people who do not use turbo yeast because of the flavors that it emits, you're not the only one. I've personally used turbo yeast in the past. I am just trying to compare it with other types of yeast just to compare the flavors. So far, I'm not turned off by turbo yeast. However, I'm open to using other yeast and adding nutrients separately instead of having the turbo yeast with the nutrients in the package. The fourth reason why your wash might not be bubbling is that you've added too much sugar. So this means that the sugar might be overpowering the yeast may be under sugar shock, as they call it. There might be a lack of water, there's too much sugar inside the solution, and this is not optimal for the yeast to thrive. Once there's too much sugar, the yeast gets stressed. The fifth reason for which your wash is not bubbling is that the yeast that you pitched in was unhealthy. This may occur if you've used yeast from a previous batch, and it might have been damaged for being too hot. Yeast is a living organism, so we never know what can happen with it. It varies. To be safe, you can always use yeast from new packages, and if you're reusing yeast, it's tough to say if the yeast is dead or alive. However, just to let you know that yeast is cannibalistic, so if you pitch in dead yeast with some yeast that are alive, then the alive yeast will eat the dead ones. And the sixth reason for which your wash is not bubbling is that maybe fermentation is already done. So you don't see any bubbles inside the jar, and you just have to take a hydrometer, just measure your liquid, and if it's at 1.000 or roughly that amount, that means that the yeast has no more sugar to eat. Fermentation is done and it's time to bottle it up and drink it. So I hope these 6 reasons are valuable to you, and if you'd like, you can share with someone that's in this process of making their own homemade rum. If you found this video valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe.